It began quietly, the way most irreversible things do. Not with chaos, not with temptation, not with a single moment that could be pointed at and blamed, but with stillness. The kind that lives between sentences. The kind that doesn't announce itself until it's already settled in the room. He came over that day like he always did, with the same casual warmth that had belonged to every shared dinner, every friendly visit, every laugh that once belonged to someone else's story. The familiarity was supposed to make it harmless. That's what made it dangerous. The house was heavy with a silence that had been building for months, a silence that stretched across rooms, across routines, across the spaces between two people who had stopped being each other's reason and settled for being each other's habit, he noticed without asking. He always did. There was no performance in the way he looked at things, no pity either, just presence. The kind that doesn't demand, doesn't rescue, doesn't speak unless silence needs company. The conversation started as small talk. Weather, work, small distractions that tried to keep the truth behind closed doors, but something in the air kept softening. Words slowed, voices dropped, pauses grew longer than necessary. The distance between sentences became the language itself. There was something about him that understood stillness, not the awkward kind, but the healing kind. The kind that lets wounds breathe. When laughter came, it came easy, real, unforced. It wasn't loud, but it filled the spaces that used to ache. He didn't ask about the pain directly, though it hung between them like a shadow neither could unsee. Instead, he told stories. Small ones. Mundane, almost meaningless on the surface. The way he once drove through a thunderstorm. How he still kept old letters from a friend he'd lost. How silence can be beautiful when it's shared. The words weren't about him. They were about what it means to stay when it's easier to leave. There was no spark, no rush, no forbidden thrill. Just recognition. Like two people meeting again after years of pretending they hadn't been walking toward each other all along. The first time his hand brushed against mine, it wasn't electricity that followed. It was warmth, the kind that hums quietly beneath the skin and asks nothing of it. My body didn't flinch. It remembered. It remembered what gentleness could feel like when it didn't have to apologize for existing. That night, after he left, the air felt different. Not lighter, but honest. The walls seemed to exhale. There was a faint ache where his presence had been, not because of what happened, but because of what didn't. The absence of wrongness felt like a betrayal in itself. Days passed the way. Days do when you're trying not to think about something deliberately ordinary, chores, conversations, that stayed above water. But every now and then, memory slipped in like light through curtains. The tone of his voice, the way his eyes didn't flinch when everything else did, the way he made silence feel safe instead of empty. He started visiting more often, though never without reason. A broken shelf that needed fixing. A stray errand that somehow required company. There was always an explanation, but none of them were true. The truth was simpler. We both needed somewhere to rest that didn't require pretending. Once, while he was talking about something trivial, his words stopped mid-sentence. Not because of hesitation, but because the truth had arrived between us again. Silent, undeniable, patient. The air thickened, and for a moment, neither of us breathed. I could hear the sound of the clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the pulse in my wrist. Everything ordinary felt heightened, holy. Then he smiled, a small, quiet smile that carried understanding, maybe even apology. "You deserve peace," he said. "Not love, not escape, peace." The word hung there like a prayer too fragile to touch. After that, it was harder to pretend. Every interaction became layered, words carrying weight they weren't built for, glances that lasted a second too long. Yet nothing crossed the line, not because we were strong, but because neither of us wanted to break what was still innocent. Desire, when it came, wasn't sudden. It was patient, tender, a slow unfurling. It arrived not as hunger, but as awareness of how rare it was to be seen without being asked to explain. He never reached out without reason, never touched without hesitation. But when his fingers brushed a strand of hair from my face, something inside me stilled. It wasn't passion. It was peace wearing passion's disguise. We never said the words. Maybe because naming things makes them smaller. Maybe because the world already had names for people like us, and none of them were kind. But in the unspoken, there was everything. Nights grew longer. Messages came slower but deeper. Every conversation felt like standing at the edge of something sacred and forbidden. Neither of us stepped closer, but we didn't step away either. That was the truth of it. The pull that wasn't about want, but about recognition. Two people who had been invisible too long finally finding someone who looked back and saw. And then, one evening without ceremony, everything changed. Not because of a confession, but because silence finally gave its blessing. The look we shared didn't ask for anything. It only acknowledged what had already been true. No one would ever understand it from the outside. The tenderness that didn't demand, the love that wasn't built from rebellion, but from understanding. It wasn't about stealing anything. It was about returning something long lost. The ability to feel seen, to be real again. Love, I learned, doesn't always come to rewrite your life. Sometimes it comes to remind you it's still yours. He didn't fix the pain. He didn't save anyone. He just stayed, quietly, completely, honestly. And that was enough. It didn't begin with a choice, at least not a conscious one. The heart doesn't sit down to negotiate the rules before it feels. It just stumbles forward, blind and hopeful, while the rest of life tries to catch up. That's how it started, not in betrayal but in confusion. A blur between what was right and what was real. He was always there, orbiting close enough to matter, distant enough to pretend it didn't. The kind of presence that doesn't demand attention, but commands it anyway. There was something about the way he looked at things. Slow, deliberate, unafraid to stay a little too long on the details everyone else ignored. At first it was harmless, just familiarity made comfortable by time. But hearts are poor at recognizing their own turning points. It was during an ordinary afternoon, when sunlight fell through the blinds and stretched across the floor like quiet memory. He was talking about something simple, a book maybe, or a story he'd heard. And laughter came easily, the kind that doesn't belong to strangers. For a second, everything felt effortless. Then came the pause, the silence that lingers just a moment too long. The air changed first, denser, charged, and in that stillness, something unspoken woke up. It wasn't desire that struck first. It was recognition. The sudden awareness that comfort had turned into connection, that understanding had quietly crossed into longing. The realization was terrifying not because it was wrong, but because it felt right in ways it shouldn't. After that, every glance carried two meanings, one spoken, one swallowed. Every word was layered with restraint, as if the heart had learned a language the mouth wasn't allowed to speak. He never said anything, and neither did I, because saying it out loud would have made it real, and real meant dangerous. We became experts at pretending, at smiling just long enough, at stepping back when it would have been easier to stay. Yet, beneath all that careful choreography, something truer kept beating. It wasn't a rebellion. It was a quiet surrender, not to lust, but to recognition. There were days I told myself it was nothing. That friendship could look like this, could feel like this, without crossing a line. And maybe it could have, if not for the way his silence answered questions I didn't ask, or the way my heart steadied only when his name appeared in the room. He never touched me without reason, and yet every accidental brush of his hand left an ache that lingered longer than it should. Once, while passing a cup across the table, our fingers met. It wasn't a spark. Those fade fast. It was something slower, deeper. A pulse that echoed somewhere. Memory keeps its quiet promises. The moment lasted less than a breath, but everything after felt altered by it. The guilt arrived late, dressed as loyalty. It whispered reminders of vows and boundaries, of everything that made this wrong. It asked questions that didn't have answers. How could something that felt so healing also feel forbidden? Why did the world only measure love by the damage it caused, not the peace it created? He seemed to carry the same battle inside. Sometimes his eyes would find mine and stop just short of confession. He spoke with restraint, every word measured, every breath an apology. And yet, in that restraint, I saw his truth. He was trying not to break the world around us, but he was already broken in the same shape as me. There was no plan, no plot, no betrayal in motion. Only gravity. The kind that pulls two people toward each other no matter how well they understand the cost. We fought it in small ways, standing farther apart, talking less, pretending the air wasn't thicker when we shared it. But the heart, once it recognizes its reflection, refuses to forget. The night it finally happened wasn't cinematic. There was no music, no storm outside, no grand declaration, just exhaustion. Two people tired of pretending, tired of half versions of themselves. It began with honesty, a few words too raw to take back. He said he couldn't stop thinking about what shouldn't exist, and for once, I didn't pretend not to know what he meant. Silence followed, heavy, but not cruel. The kind that holds truth instead of hiding it. When he reached for my hand, there was no urgency, no hunger, just a trembling calm. Every line we'd drawn blurred, then disappeared. That touch wasn't about possession. It was about release, the kind of relief that comes from finally being seen after years of invisibility. The body didn't betray. It remembered. It remembered warmth, laughter, being looked at like it mattered. Afterward, guilt didn't arrive the way people imagine it, loud, punishing, righteous. It came quietly, disguised as morning light. It sat between us, asking what this meant now, how we could carry something so fragile into a world that would never understand it. But even as the questions came, something inside me was still, because it hadn't been a mistake. It wasn't something stolen or forced. It was truth, uninvited, unplanned, but undeniable. He didn't ask for promises, and I didn't offer any. We both knew this wasn't something that could fit into rules. But the heart doesn't need permission to feel. It just needs courage to keep beating. Days afterward, life went on as it always does. Conversations resumed their practiced distance. Laughter wore its polite mask again. But something irreversible had shifted. It wasn't the act itself that changed everything. It was the honesty it brought. The kind that strips away pretense until only truth remains. There's a cost to that kind of honesty. It doesn't destroy, but it does demand. It asks you to live with what you've seen, to stop pretending you can unlearn what real connection feels like. And so we didn't try to undo it. We carried it quietly, not as sin, but as secret light. Love doesn't always arrive wrapped in approval. Sometimes it comes dressed in confusion, shaking the foundation of everything you thought you knew about loyalty, faith, and rightness. It asks you to see not who you should love, but who your soul already recognizes. And maybe the world will never understand that there was no betrayal. Only two hearts trying to make sense of the truth too big for permission. Because some love stories don't ask for forgiveness. They simply reveal what truth looks like when it's finally brave. It didn't arrive as a decision. It arrived as weather, the kind that turns up after days of holding its breath, when the sky finally admits what it's been carrying. It was late, the hour that makes truth braver than caution. Lamps low, a room that knew our names, the soft domestic hush of a house that wasn't sure whether to sleep or listen. Silence had been our careful guardian for so long, but that night it loosened its grip and let us speak without sound. He stood a step closer than usual, not enough to be reckless, just enough to be honest. The distance that had guarded us remembered its job and then forgot it. A sleeve brushed a sleeve. I felt the small, astonishing relief that comes when a life that's been holding itself together realizes it doesn't have to. We were both tired of polite sentences, the kind that make a body feel like an empty room. Our breaths found each other first, slow, measured, a conversation without grammar. Nothing dramatic happened. That's the holy part. No declarations, no arguments with ghosts. Just presence. Hands learning again what hands are for when they're trusted. steadiness, the courage to wait, the warmth that proves a person is real. When his fingers grazed my wrist, the old alarm stayed quiet. It didn't feel like crossing a line. It felt like stepping into a home I'd been looking at through windows for years. He said my name the way a prayer enters the world, gentle and certain. Not to claim, not to correct, just to bless what was already true. Something inside me unknotted with that sound. For so long I'd been careful. The kind of careful that smooths itself into every hour until even joy feels like a trespass. But the kind of wanting that arrived that night didn't argue with conscience. It agreed with it. It said yes to everything tender and refused everything that would have made us small. We didn't rush. Patience is a kind of devotion. His touch asked before it answered. My body, surprised by its own calm, answered before I could find a single word. There is a difference between hunger and recognition. I learned it in the quiet way my shoulders lowered, the way my breath stopped reaching for air like a sparrow against glass, and simply stayed. The world outside had its rules. The world inside kept offering proof that we were not breaking anything. We were mending something. I could list the tiny things as if they were beads on a cord. The lamp's warm circle of light. The tea gone cold on the table, no one bothered to move. The way his thumb traced patience along the edge of my hand. The brief, amazed laughter that slipped out of both of us like a secret discovering it had nothing left to hide. Each detail small enough to miss. Together, large enough to remake a life. He had always been careful with language. That night, he became careful with silence, too, placing it like a scarf around the places that needed gentleness. When our foreheads touched, the past finally agreed to sit on the porch instead of driving the car. I felt the lifetime it had taken to arrive exactly here press against the skin and then release. It wasn't rescue, though goodness knows we'd both needed saving in other seasons. It was belonging. Not to each other as possession, but to ourselves as truth. Memories tried to line up like accusers at the edge of the room. They didn't shout. They didn't have to. I knew their names by heart. But even they quieted at the way kindness chose its steps. He gave me time as if it were an heirloom, not a commodity. I gave him trust not as proof, but as breath. If love is a grammar, we conjugated it in the present tense. I am here. You are here. Let this be. When his mouth found mine, it wasn't a conquest. It felt like the first time a name is spoken correctly, the miracle of recognition made into air and heat. The kiss stayed near the surface at first, a shoreline we walked without forcing the ocean to explain itself. Then deeper, not because urgency demanded it, but because safety allowed it. Every part of me that had learned to shrink found a light and expanded toward it. We paused often, not to doubt but to honor. Questions arrived and were answered without words. Are you safe? Yes. Do you want this? Yes. Can the world wait? Yes, just for now. He laughed once into my shoulder. A low, disbelieving sound. The kind people make when a door they thought was locked opens to a room that feels like their own childhood home. I felt the smile before I heard it, and the joy of it made everything else seem less sharp. Time changed shapes. The clock did its blunt arithmetic, but the moment did a softer math. In that gentler measure, minutes became wide fields where we could walk unhurried and unafraid. Eyes mapped faces like cartographers of mercy. The body wrote its clear, unembarrassed sentences. Nothing in me wanted to apologize. I had it ready, the apology for existing, for needing, for daring, but it fell out of my hands and onto the floor and did not break anything. Outside, the street kept its ordinary rhythm. A late bus exhaling at the corner, a neighbor's door murmuring shut, a far siren doing its necessary work. None of it argued with us. The world, so quick to weigh and measure, stayed politely beyond the glass, while a smaller world inside chose tenderness and called it enough. After we didn't stage a ceremony of meaning, no one swore vows, no one tried to trap truth in a definition. We lay there, listening to the language that comes after choosing, the low, grateful quiet, the careful reaching for the other's hand, the slow return of everyday sounds as if the house itself were waking to the news that it could trust us. He touched my hair like a person touches a shoreline they intend to keep clean. I traced the place where his pulse announced itself with the steady dignity of something that has done its work through good weather and bad. Guilt did wander in because it is devout and punctual, but it did not know where to sit. It looked for a wound and found instead a room rearranged to fit two honest hearts. Loyalty stood there as well, no longer a guard with a whistle, but a witness with a lantern. What it illuminated wasn't abandonment. It was integrity, of feeling, of care, of refusing to lie to the part of ourselves that had been waiting too long to be invited back into the body. We spoke finally, as people do when their mouths have caught up to their courage. Not about the world and its verdicts, not about the scripts we'd broken by refusing to keep pretending, but about breakfast and walking and who we might become if we kept telling the truth as softly and steadily as this night had taught us. Plans humble enough to be holy. Coffee. A call. A door opened in daylight with the same tenderness that had opened it now. When he left, it wasn't a retreat. It was an agreement with morning. He paused at the threshold, his palm a warm blessing against my cheek, eyes unafraid to stay. The hallway light made a small gold river along the floorboards. I stood inside that narrow brightness long after the latch clicked, feeling the house re-breathe around me, hearing the old narrative loosen its old claim. Sleep found me in pieces and put me back together. I woke with the oddest sense that nothing had changed and everything had. The mirror did not argue. It reflected a face that had simply stopped bracing. I made coffee and carried it to the window and watched the day arrive without bargaining. My phone lit up. 3 words, no embroidery. Are you okay? The kind of question that proves itself by having the answer inside it already. I wrote back what the night had taught me to know. I'm home. Because sometimes the holiest moment is not when love announces itself, but when it finally stops pretending. You said, "It didn't fall apart the way everyone imagines. It didn't explode or crumble in a single night. It unfolded slowly, gently, like dawn filtering through curtains, steady, certain, unafraid of being seen. Love, the real kind, rarely arrives with drama. It comes as clarity, the kind that doesn't demand explanations, only truth. After everything that had been said and done, the silence between us no longer carried tension. It carried peace. The kind earned after a storm, when even the wreckage looks like a map toward something new. What had once felt forbidden began to look like forgiveness. Not the kind handed down by others, but the kind you give yourself when you finally stop pretending you don't deserve to be whole. He didn't come to rewrite my story. He came to remind me that I still had one. His presence wasn't loud, it was grounding, the calm after years of holding my breath. Every glance, every quiet word, every small gesture stitched something back together inside me. It wasn't about forgetting where I had been. It was about finally seeing it differently. He never asked to be a savior. He just refused to let me keep living as if I was something that needed saving. Love, I realized, doesn't always rescue you. Sometimes it hands you back your own reflection and waits while you remember who you are. There were moments when guilt still whispered, soft and persistent. The world has its rules about what love should look like, who it should belong to, and what it's allowed to heal. But every time that voice rose, something quieter answered. A voice that sounded like truth. It said, "This isn't betrayal, it's awakening." He taught me that redemption isn't about undoing the past, it's about reclaiming it. The past didn't vanish between us, it softened. The ache that used to burn started to glow instead, like embers that no longer destroyed but warmed. Every story, even the ones built from mistakes, carries light if you let it. One evening, we sat in silence as the day folded into night. There was no need to fill the space. He reached for my hand, and that simple act said everything language could never manage. I see you, not as who you were, but as who you are now. In that touch, the years of holding back melted. The love that grew between us wasn't built on fantasy or escape. It was built on recognition, two people who had walked through their own ruins and found each other among the remains. We didn't erase what came before. We honored it, even the pain, because it had brought us here. In the quiet, I learned that redemption doesn't arrive with grand gestures. It comes in the smallest moments. A look that says, "You're safe." A laugh that feels like air returning to the lungs. A night where silence feels like prayer instead of punishment. People talk about love as if it's supposed to be perfect, but perfection never heals anyone. It's the cracks that make room for light, the flaws that let tenderness enter. We weren't perfect. We were real, and that was enough. Sometimes I still think about how wrong it must have looked from the outside. How people might have seen only what they could name: betrayal, mistake, mess. But they didn't see the quiet redemption hidden beneath it, the way love had turned guilt into grace. They didn't hear how laughter had replaced the noise of shame, how peace had taken root where pain once lived. Love didn't erase the past, it reframed it. The scars became stories. The wrong turns became directions. The heartbreak became an opening. Every moment before him stopped being something to regret and became something that led me to recognition. He once told me that everyone deserves someone who looks at them and doesn't flinch from the truth. I think that's what we were for each other. A mirror that didn't distort, didn't judge, just reflected what was real. There was freedom in that honesty. Freedom to stop running from the things that had shaped me. Freedom to love without fear of consequence. Freedom to finally breathe without asking for permission. I used to think redemption was something that came after forgiveness. Now I know it's what happens when you start living in truth. He didn't give me a new story. He helped me see that my old one still had beauty in it. In his presence, the ache became understanding, the guilt became peace, and the silence became a promise that what's real doesn't need to be perfect to be worthy. Some loves begin with fireworks. Ours began with stillness, and in that stillness, everything broken found its place again. It wasn't about choosing one over another. It was about finally choosing what was true, because some mistakes aren't mistakes at all. They're the universe shaking you awake, whispering, "This is who you were meant to become." If this story touched something quiet inside you, stay. Like, share, and subscribe for more journeys where forbidden love becomes freedom and broken hearts learn to breathe again. Because here, we don't chase perfect endings. We tell real ones. Welcome to True Love Story with Deep Love.